Absolutely. And I said this at the first service for those of you who weren't here, but I feel like it's important to say it again. We have one of the absolutely best worship bands that I've ever been around. And so they are just so incredible about leading us, not just in incredible, the quality of the music is incredible, but the level of worship and the way they lead us into that is so incredible. So thank you. Thank you for what you do. So this morning is our second week of our Saints and Silver series. It's our series for the month of October where we're going to be exploring the lives of 4 different saints and looking at their relationship with money and materiality and the way they think about possessions. And last week, we started off with Saint Joan of Delano, a French saint. And if you're wondering why there's a creepy naked baby and a broom on the stage, and you didn't watch last week, you should probably just pause and go back and watch that and then join, because you're going to be really distracted by this, okay? Somebody got a text last week and said, hey, y'all left a broom on the stage. You might want to get it off before worship starts again. But that's intentional. Go watch last week, all right? But St. Joan of Delano is who we talked about. Tyler did a really incredible job talking about her last week, and really a very cool kind of Ebenezer Scrooge story of redemption and just a beautiful transformation in terms of how she understood money and possession and wealth. Now, before last week's sermon, I didn't really know who St. Joan of Delano was. That was a new person for me and a new understanding for me. This week's going to be probably different. I would imagine most of you didn't know who St. Joan was before last week, like myself. This week, I guarantee you know who we're talking about, and Andrew's already alluded to it. But this saint shares the name with the Golden Arch city. This saint, the current pope, took his name from this saint. We have an order of monks that bear the name of this saint, the Franciscan monks, and they're known for having really, really interesting and progressive theology, but also really horrible haircuts. I don't know if you noticed the haircut there, but you probably best know the saint, though, from your grandmother's garden. Your grandmother probably had a Saint Francis statue in her garden. I know mine did, and so this saint is someone that we're really familiar with. Unlike Saint Joan, Saint Francis is a name that we're really familiar with. From San Francisco to Pope Francis to those little garden statues, we know who Saint Francis is. But do we really know Saint Francis? And I would argue, unless you know the story of a person, unless you know the background of a person, you don't really know who they are. Because the problem with saints a lot of times is we see them like this. We see them in stained glass, and we see them as icons, and we see these beautiful images with gilded halos, and we believe that is the saint. But the problem is that's only one moment in the saint's life. It doesn't necessarily reflect their entire existence. And when we talk about St. Francis, it most certainly doesn't. St. Francis was born in 1181, so he's born in the medieval times. And he was born in Italy to a wealthy merchant family. And they were his dad was a linen merchant. Okay, so he dealt in really, really fine pieces of cloth, really fine linens, and was well known as trafficking in some of the finest linens in all of Italy. And so here's a nice representation of the sort of cloth that he would deal in. So St. Francis grew up, not as St. Francis, just as Francis. Francis grew up in a home that was incredibly wealthy. He had everything, not only that he needed, but he wanted. And if you're familiar with the medieval times, that's no small thing. St. Francis had everything in terms of wealth, possession, and money. The thing about Francis, though, is he was not always a saint. As a matter of fact, some would call him right the opposite of a saint. He was known by the age of 14 in his little village of Assisi. He was known as the kid who did everything wrong. By 14, he had a reputation of drinking in excess and womanizing. Okay, I'm not talking about a 21-year-old. This is a 14-year-old, okay? And he was already known as that at that age. Around 14 or 15, he actually dropped out of school to pursue these other pleasures in life. And he's like the youth group kid. I've been doing youth ministry for 22 years. He's the youth group kid that you hated seeing coming to get on the bus for the youth group trip, because you knew you were going to have to bird dog that kid the entire time, right? You're going to have to be on that kid the entire time because you know they're going to cause trouble, right? He was a kid, as soon as he got on and he put his bag under the bus, you'd look in the bag to make sure there wasn't any alcohol or tobacco in it. He was the kid, I said in the earlier service, he was the kid that I would send Mr. Ed on and have Ed follow him everywhere he goes on our youth retreat. Because if he wasn't sneaking off to smoke, he was going to sneak off and try to find the girls' cabin, right? That's Francis. He was that kid, okay? He was awful. I mean, he really was. He was an awful kid. He had these dreams that he was going to be a medieval knight. That was sort of like the action hero of the medieval times. And he had these wild fantasies that he was going to be an action hero like the medieval knights. And so in his late teens, his village, his area came into a war with another village. And he saw this as his opportunity to step in and become this big action hero. Now, granted, Francis had never had military training. He had never been in war. He didn't know anything about what he was doing, but he had these grandiose ideas that he was going to ride in and save the day. And so his very first battle, it was a horrible, bloody battle. Carnage everywhere, the dead, the dying, all over the battlefield. Within the first hour or so, Francis is captured. He was a horrible soldier. He had no training. He had no business being out there. And within the first hour or so, he was captured. Now, this was unusual because when he was captured, he was seeing all of his friends, all of his comrades, all of the people from his village dead and dying out on the battlefield. And he was one of the only ones, and some accounts say he was the only one that was spared. You see, what happened was he was kept alive because underneath his armor, he had incredibly fine linen. He wore the best to the battlefield. And all the other soldiers, usually of a lower echelon in terms of their class and their society, they had hand-me-downs, they had tattered clothes, but he had beautiful linens on underneath his armor. He was kept alive because of what he had on. I think about Francis and what this does to you mentally. I mean, we know about this concept of survivor's guilt, but I imagine it's even worse in that situation, not because of any value of your own, but purely because of the clothes that you were wearing. He was kept alive. His captors kept him, sent a ransom note to his father, because they knew because of his clothing they could get a large ransom to increase their war chest. So they sent a ransom note to his father, and eventually his father sent them a lot of money to let Francis go. Old Testament theologian Walter Brueggemann, who's just down I-20 over in Atlanta, he's at Columbia Seminary. He's one of the foremost experts on the Old Testament in the entire world. He has a form that he puts on top of Old Testament characters and stories in the Old Testament, and you can do this with New Testament as well. It's a form that you put on them to understand their progression and their development as characters in the biblical narrative. This progression is orientation, disorientation, reorientation. And it goes like this. In orientation, we have an oriented view of the world. We understand the world in a certain way. We get up in the morning, we put on our clothes, we take a shower, we go about our routine in a normal way. We go to our jobs, we do the same things, we come home to the same people, we do the same stuff on the weekend. We have a philosophy of life. Things are normal. We have an orientation to this world. But what happens is, in disorientation, a crisis occurs. Some kind of crisis, a physical crisis, a health crisis. It could be war, it could be famine, it could be COVID-19. A crisis happens that derails what is normal. And this is disorientation. It disorients, it dislodges your normal worldview, how you see the world. And what happens is, in disorientation, you have a choice. You can you're at a crossroads in disorientation. You can choose to either go back and double down on the way life was in orientation, or you get to step forward and grow into what he calls as the third stage, reorientation. It's where you don't go back to normal, because what you realize is that disorientation helps you realize that what was normal actually wasn't working for you anyways. It just took a moment of disorientation. It took a moment of going off the rails, giving you time to pause and reflect. Some would say kind of like quarantine, to just sit and be alone with your thoughts for a while. And you realize the way I was doing things wasn't really working. It was just what I knew. So the other option is you have the ability to pivot and to step forward into a new way of being. Not the old way, but a new way. It's sort of like The Matrix. If you ever watched the Matrix movies, it's just like the first one with Neo, and he had a life, he understood it, and then there was that disorienting moment where he was ripped out of his world. If you've never seen it, I'm sorry, I'm hopefully not ruining a lot, but you've had like 20 years to watch this movie, so don't blame me, all right? So he's kind of ripped out of his world and goes through a crisis, and then he has a choice. He can go back into the way he used to be, or he has the opportunity to move forward in a brand new way. I would argue that Brueggemann's understanding, his form of orientation, disorientation, reorientation, is not just for biblical characters, but it's for all of us. If we overlay that model on top of the life of St. Francis, you can see it very clearly. Francis was living his life. He was relishing in his life. He was having a blast. If you are an Enneagram person, if you're not, we should talk afterwards, but if you're an Enneagram person, St. Francis was a 7. He was a hardcore 7. He wanted to suck the marrow out of life, experience all the things. Then this moment happened where he was captured, held ransom, and everything changed. It said when Francis came back to his village after he was ransomed, it says that he was sick in both body and mind. And I can imagine that. I can imagine being hauled off with your hands tied and seeing your friends, people you grew up with, scattered across a battlefield, dead and dying. I can imagine what that does to your mind. And then when you're able to reflect on it a little more and you hear your captors talking, you realize that it's not because you yourself have any value to them. It's purely what they can get from you. The clothes you have on your body and the wealth of your father. I can imagine as he sat captive for months, waiting on the ransom to come through, I can imagine this going through his head over and over and contemplating it and finally going, my enemies have the exact same mindset that I've had my entire life. That the value of an individual is not based on something intrinsic, but based on something they wear, something they possess, something they own, their ability to buy, their ability to possess and own things. I imagine him sitting there captive in a cell and his entire constructed worldview falling apart. I can imagine him ripping the clothes from his body. Although those linens kept him alive, they were the cause of so much death as well. It reminds me of Jesus being hung on a cross and soldiers at his feet gambling for his clothes. The Son of God who loved everyone, who hugged the leper, who healed the woman, who talked to the stranger, who did so much good. His only value were the clothes at his feet, the tunic and the robe that had been ripped off of him. This was a huge crisis point for St. Francis. A few years ago, I was spending some time with a friend. He was the dad of 3 kids. His 3 kids had grown up in my youth group, and that I was a youth minister of, and we were on a retreat, and it was one of those late nights where all the kids were in bed, and we're just sitting up talking, hanging out together. And he said, "Stephen, I'm in a bad place." I said, "What's going on? This is a great guy, great family." He said, "I'm in a bad place." He said, "I'm in my early 50s. And he said, I've got a lot of friends who are in this exact same place with me. He said, I'm in my early 50s. And me and all my friends, we have worked our tails off our entire life. And we have built wealth. We have accomplished so many things in our different fields. We have accumulated all the things we ever thought we would need and then some. We have the boats. We have the lake houses. We go on the big vacations. Our kids have never wanted for anything." He says, "Stephen, we're miserable. We did everything that we were taught to do. We did everything that we were told would make us happy, and we're miserable." He said, and we're all at this sort of strange crossroads. And he said, half of us are at this crisis point, and we're kind of doubling down and saying, well, maybe my boat isn't the nicest boat on the lake. Maybe I need to add a couple of thousand square footage to my lake house. Maybe the $50,000 car isn't really what's making me happy. Maybe it's the $70,000 car. You know what? I've got this great family, but maybe I get a little something going on the side. He said, my friends are dealing with this, and he said they are in a full-on self-destructive mode. I said, well, how are you? He said, I'm not doing that. He said, I think I'm starting to find peace. I said, well, where are you finding peace? He said, well, first off, he said, the more I get rid of these things and kind of minimize these things, I'm finding relief. He said, I worked my whole life to gain, and it's become a weight around my neck. He said, but the place I'm finding peace, I find peace in nature. He said, I find peace with my family. He said, I'm finding peace in those things that I can't buy. I'm finding peace in those things I can't own, and I can't say, this belongs to me. He said, I'm finding peace in things that are bigger than me, bigger than something I can write a check for. He had a crisis. We, for the past 7 months, have been in a crisis. Never in any of our lifetimes have we experienced something like we're experiencing right now. And I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with people who say, I just can't wait for things to get back to normal. And here's the thing, I've said it 100 times myself. Well, when things get back to normal. But what we don't realize is that crisis is a blessing. Crisis is an opportunity for us to stop, for us to breathe, for us to look and reevaluate and look back and say, you know what, so much of what was normal, maybe one, wasn't normal. And maybe two, it wasn't helpful. And maybe even on a systemic level, is why we're here now. Crisis can be such a blessing for change and for growth. I remember back in 2005, we were in seminary. We found some really cheap tickets to Italy. We'd always wanted to go to Italy, and we'd found some really cheap tickets, so we booked the tickets, and we took a little 10-day trip to Italy, my wife and I and 2 of our best friends, another married couple. And we took this trip to Italy, and I planned the whole trip. You know, we saw all the things. I mean, we went at a breakneck pace. And still to this day, I've been to Italy 3 times now, and still to this day, the The thing that I cherish most about that trip was not the Colosseum, was not the Palatine Hill, was not the beautiful canals of Venice or the rolling Tuscan hillsides. It was my trip to Assisi, to go to the hometown of St. Francis. Now, if you've ever been to Assisi, you know Assisi is a medieval village on a hillside. It's about an hour train ride south of Florence. And I wanted to be really intentional about this trip, about this experience of Assisi and St. Francis. And so it's back when you had iPods, not an iPhone that had all your music on it. So I had my iPod, and I had it loaded with a couple of versions of the song we sang earlier, All Creatures of Our God and King. And for the entire train ride, I listened to All Creatures of Our God and King on repeat. And I had some readings of St. Francis that I read while I was on the train. And I'm glad I did, because it put me in a mindset to allow me to experience what was going to happen next. So you get off at the train station and you wander up these kind of meandering, twisty roads up the hill through this medieval village, up to the Basilica of St. Francis on top of the hill. It's beautiful. It's huge. Massive basilica. When you walk in, the top floor, there's 3 levels to this basilica, and the top level is this gorgeous, huge, ornate basilica with giant frescoes on the wall of the life of St. Francis. If I remember correctly, this portrait of St. Francis is actually from one of those frescoes on the wall. And it shows his entire life in these frescoes, and it's gorgeous. And you go down to the next level, and on the next level, it's another beautiful, albeit a little smaller, cathedral down below. Beautiful mosaics, gorgeous gilded walls, unbelievable beauty. But I remember having this unease with it. Knowing the life of St. Francis, knowing who he was, what he stood for, it felt a little out of place. That is, until I went to the lower level. It's the catacombs. It's a small cruciform-shaped chapel at the very bottom. And it's small. It's about the area down here at the altar. Very small cruciform chapel. Nothing's gilded. No beautiful mosaics, frescoes. No artwork really of any. It's just medieval stone walls. And very sparse wooden benches. Not comfortable at all. It's kind of cold. And in the middle of that chapel, right in the heart of the cross, is a stone column. It's about this wide. And it's that same stone, and it's wrapped up into a column. And inside that column are the bones of St. Francis. I love that, because he didn't belong in the gilded frescoes. He didn't belong among the ornate artwork. He belonged in this simple, small place. It's just like him and what he found in his life. I remember sitting in that chapel, alternating between weeping and praying. You know when you've been to a holy place, because that's about all you can do. And I kept going back and forth, and the only thing you could hear the creak of one of those wooden benches, you could hear the whispers of prayers, and you can hear the sniffles of pilgrims crying, because they were experiencing the same thing I was experiencing. That chapel reflects what St. Francis found to be a reality. That these things don't bring us happiness. They don't bring us completion. They don't make us whole. And in fact, oftentimes, they can be the very things that don't allow those things to happen in our lives. It said once he came back, once he was ransomed, he went through this massive life crisis. He rejected this. He rejected the textile industry. He rejected his dad's business, his wealth. He told his dad, I don't have any part of it. Writings tell us that St. Francis and his dad never talked after that again. And he put this away and traded it in for what is described as burlap cloth. He traded in these beautiful fine linens for burlap. He understood finally that his value wasn't based on this. It wasn't based in the size of his home or the things that he drove. It wasn't based in anything that had materiality. It was based in something so much bigger. It wasn't about things that he could own or possess or control. He finally found his value in God. He found his value in something so much bigger than himself that he could never fully possess it or understand it. My friend who I was talking to, the 50-year-old dad, he began to allude to those things as well. You see, the problem is we get wrapped up in believing that we can buy fulfillment, that we can buy happiness, that we can buy contentment. And our relationship with things becomes wildly distorted. St. Francis took that disorienting experience and he let it change him. He let it grow him. My hope is that when we have these experiences that throw us off the track, that make what's normal seem wrong or seem strange, that we'll take that as an opportunity to step forward into something new, something that God is calling us into. I want to close with two quotes today, and one is by a famous writer, turn of the century naturalist. He's actually the reason why we have national parks. A guy named John Muir. And John Muir says, "In God's wildness lies the hope of the world." And then the last quote I want to give you is this. It's from these two guys. They do a podcast called The Minimalist Podcast. They write books. And they say this at the end of every single podcast. They say, love people and use things, because the opposite never works. We have the opportunity to reorient ourselves towards something new. I pray that you will take this crisis, this disorientation that we're experiencing, and not yearn for what was, but look forward to what can be. St. Francis is known as the saint of nature, of the animals. That's why you always see him with a wolf. There's this legendary story of him and a wolf. A lot of times you'll see him with a wolf by his side. You'll see him holding birds. And I think St. Francis found his peace in something that was far bigger than him, far bigger than he could own or ever possess. And that's my prayer for you and me today. Let's pray.